Good afternoon. My name is Kalia Tejas. I'm the Environmental Policy Fellow at the Ohio Environmental Council, and I'm here today with Dr. Michael Charles. Michael, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. So I'm going to go ahead and start by introducing myself in my traditional language. So, Yate she Michael Charles Yuneshe, Bilagana Nishle, Shihi Bashchin, Bilagana Dashche, Nakai Dene additionally. So, hello, my name is Michael Charles. I'm Dene, or from the Navajo Nation.
First, I do want to talk about that hope piece. I think it's really important that we brought that up. Hope and self-preservation and, concepts of burnout, that's so important in a space like this, especially when you are representing communities who are already facing the impacts of climate change. I wrote down a quote that Boris Johnson made where he said, we'll look back at COP26 in Glasgow as the beginning of the end to climate change, which I felt was rather a tone-deaf statement. To contrast that, a Pacific Island warrior, Joseph Sekulu, said, optimism is not a choice for his community. Frankly, there won't be an end to climate change. We have set in motion a chain of events that have already been harming people across the world and will continue to. It is a conversation of how much are we going to continue to let happen. And these negotiations, this space can be very traumatic and very heavy for those whose communities are already facing that, whether it's First Nations in Canada who have lost land access due to melting ice, or Pacific Island nations that are underwater, or even Indigenous nations nearby who are those front fence line communities to polluting industries. So how did you and your community there at COP26 find hope within each other and find that safety and preservation, against everything, all the, all of the doom and gloom that is occurring?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I love how these conversations begin to unfold so many other things.
Yeah,
because I was, as you were asking the question, I was also thinking back to kind of where we started with, before we started talking about Article 6, was what are the other topics we're following, and that kind of goes back to, we follow also adaptation, loss and damage, all these things that are topics that, and usually tracks that are in the negotiations, but all those things are necessary. It's not that once we we're not, like you mentioned, we're not going to see the beginning to the end of climate change because we're already seeing the impacts. And I think a lot of times when we talk about climate change as a future thing, and I think that's starting to happen less and less, actually, even just within the last 5 years of my work there. And I remember even reflecting that first time, it was always talked about kind of, in 2030 we have to meet here or else we're going to see climate impacts. But what the reality was is we especially what's really great about the global perspective of Indigenous communities is we got to hear the stories of, directly what was happening in the Arctic, of how they have to now change the way that they herd their reindeer, the way that they change the foraging practices. And we got to connect it with those in the Pacific and how the sea level rise is impacting the sacred sites that they have along the shore and just even the way where their communities have to keep kind of changing. And so I think that's all a huge perspective to kind of bring into this, and is that the climate change is happening. There are a lot of impacts right now. It's not always just about anxiety towards the future. Right. So thank you for that context, and now I'll start to answer the question. And so I think the biggest thing of hope that I've always found is it's right there in the people that you're working with.
Yeah.
It's not in the system, it's not in the final text and the outcome. Those are just kind of fences that you're trying to hold and set up to protect your people, to maybe help fence in other people or perpetrators or the polluters from increasing the impacts of climate. You're just kind of messing with a few different fences, but really the hope comes from the community that you're protecting. And so I think that's the most beautiful thing about why I continue to show up, is I get to work with other Indigenous peoples. I get to meet cultures from around the world. I get to hear the stories. I get to hear the knowledge that they have. And I think what's beautiful about being able to share that is, and this was actually brought up at an event we had this year for Indigenous knowledge holders. And it was this idea of the more we build community, especially within Indigenous communities, is the impacts that someone is facing could actually lead towards an environment that is already kind of known by another Indigenous community, because we're seeing these different changes. But you might see a change from one community that now faces an environment that the skills that are needed are already known by another community.
Yes.
And so being able to kind of pass on and share traditional skills and knowledges and practices is something that we're going to actually have to lean on in the future. And so that was something that I think I had never really heard before, of how do we share our cultures between communities. What it means to be Indigenous, at least to me, is it's about relationships. When I introduced myself at the beginning, I started off by telling you, this is who I am, this is where I come from, these are my grandparents, and these are the clans that we come from. That's how these different things work in our communities. We try to figure out how we're related to each other.
Right.
We figure out how we're related to Mother Earth. We figure out how we're related to every being around us, the spirit world. And so when it comes to how we work on this and address this work, it's the same thing. We can't just sit and talk about, oil is bad, or we can't have fossil fuels. And if we just stop funding fossil fuel projects, we're in the right direction. Because if you don't include everything else going in terms of the impacts it has on gender, the impacts it has on cultural identity, the impacts it has on traditional practices, food production. If we don't talk about all these things at the same time, we're just going to end up making bigger consequences in different areas. And I think the more and more we're able to build relationships with those that are really, really at the front lines and experience it in different ways than we do back home, that is so important, because it means our perspective will continue to kind of change and sharpen, and our ability to understand that urgency and the empathy that we'll build with that will continue to evolve. And that's important, because that's what we can take back home to our communities.